Hello everyone, and welcome to the live broadcast, which has been quite a bit of time in the making, and we had to go over some obstacles last time, so I again would like to express the note of gratitude for your patience. And seems like we are really all set to make sure this to be a smooth delivery when it comes to the technical side of things. So, and before I begin with the actual theme of the gathering, I would like to make a short announcement just to orient those of you for whom this is the first time, the newcomers. We have 2 week-long immersions planned for this year. And the forthcoming one, the next one, is going to be in northern Germany, where we keep returning year after year since 2017 at the modern monastery entitled Good Soundstuff. And we are there in August for a whole week. So please check the details in our website. We'll share also below the video later on. Then we have another week-long program in the United States, where we are returning first time since 2018. So it's a big event for us as an organization. And it's going to be in North Carolina at the Blue Ridge Mountains in a legendary venue. So everyone welcome to look it up if you would like to consider to join us. And there will be a shorter program in Vienna at the very end of summer, right at the end of August, the weekend overlapping onto the beginning of September. Those of you who are based in Europe or traveling in Europe during that time, this could be a fitting time to get acquainted with what this work is about. So now, with regard to this particular event that we have been preparing for a while, and we have slightly modified the title to Being Possessed by the Archetypal Forces. So this really, the purpose today is to lay out the theses and to outline the program, which we will have the chance to dive more in depth in our forthcoming online offering next Saturday. That would be Saturday, June 15th, I believe. So it will be a 3-hour gathering dedicated to this very theme. And I welcome all of you who are interested in joining us to prepare some of your questions, either based on what would be unpacked today or what you feel like bringing on the table on the actual day. Okay? All right, dears. So this is out of the way. We are ready to dive into this very interesting, fascinating, and somewhat perplexing theme of how all these individual and collective sit in relation to each other. So the title, of course, Being Possessed by the Archetypal Forces, has its intention in bringing with greater emphasis an alternative perspective on what comprises this whole strata of what we call human being, particularly when it comes to also what is known as human condition. Human condition in terms of all that conglomerate of what makes us either affected by circumstances to such degree that life turns into nothing short of suffering, or where we simply are able to live life at the fuller potential of what this life represents in terms of the embodiment. And since the allusions to Tantric teaching is all too obvious, therefore we have this subtitle, Collective Possession and Individual Freedom from the Perspective of Tantric Psychology. So in other words, this is both an invitation and a continued attempt at redefining the very driving forces behind all what could be spoken of in terms of the spectrum of human interaction, from the way we conceive ourselves as that autonomous being to the whole social strata of interactions up to that what we speak of as field of collective consciousness. Of course, this topic has been addressed and redressed, I would say, for the past maybe 60 or 70 years. And the phenomenon of collective consciousness is something which none of us can ignore any longer, simply because sooner or later we come to that realization where that what is considered to be a given set of circumstances of being born as so-and-so and having that crystallized into a certain conglomerate set of ideas which gives us that view, that perspectives, that vantage point, as well as that what is reflected back to us through the interactions with others where that picture is completed. Because let makes the immediate adjustment here, that the way we think of ourselves, the notion of identity here is not solely internal affair. In other words, that notion of identity is completed by the way we are perceived by others and how that perception of others give that reflection back to ourselves, which completes this notion, idea, concept of whom we consider ourselves to be. Of course, a lot has been said over the years, decades, and potentially centuries in terms of the importance of discarding this sense of identity, simply because it is considered to be as that what at the end of the day robs us of living life truly to the fullness of its potential, what life represents here, even as it is exemplified by this English term, human being, because it comprised of these two terms, human and being, or being human. It can be spoken interchangeably, and just by replacing being with human, somehow it begins to get that ever so more philosophical, metaphysical connotations to it. So what it means to be being human, what it truly represents, is an ongoing investigation when it comes to all things spiritual, when it comes to making all that what this embodiment represents into its true potentiality. So this ongoing investigation, ongoing not just by those of us who have gathered here, it is an ongoing investigation as far as the culture itself is concerned. It is an ongoing investigation as far as our civilizational consensus is concerned. So this question of identity, although it may seem that the answers are already given, that the whole gamut of spiritual, let's say, application here is to see through, discard, transcend all that what is comprising that individual so as to simply enjoy life from that what is the very light that illumines every experience, and simply abide in the self, as spoken in some spiritual vernacular, beingness, simply living presence fully, and all depending how this or that is being addressed or redressed by various traditions and those who speak on behalf of any particular tradition. With that being said, we cannot simply discard that whole gamut of what comprises this, even if a notion of identity. So this is where I would like to make some propositions, some suggestions, so as to put forth this potential theme, which is also could be seen as a continued expansion of what I suggest to be fundamental quality of awareness, or fundamental quality of consciousness when it comes to these affairs of being alive, and when it comes to this affair of what is the driving force behind all these actions and interactions. So this is exemplified in a Sanskrit term, Samavesha. We have unpacked this term and what it stands for some time ago last year, and have been returning to it with the greater emphasis as of, let's say, our last 2 week-long live immersions. We have also included a short excerpt in my first book, published last year, Chamatkara, The Hidden Path, where the Samavesha is given that brief outline, that introductory level. So Samavesha here represents various aspects depending on what angle, when it comes to rich tradition that India is known for, is looked at. We have consciously chosen 3. Samavesha as penetration, Samavesha as immersion, and Samavesha as possession or repossession. And it is to this aspect of possession that I would like to speak to, and this is an invitation, in a way, to partake in this research as an experiment in consciousness. Nothing more, nothing less. This exercise is conducted under the umbrella of Tantra, particularly that of Tantric Shaivism. So this quality of possession is being suggested here as being fundamental to the way consciousness functions per se. And of course, as the teaching itself will expand, potentially over the coming years, I don't know, maybe that would become an alma mater of my work, I don't know. But this proposition has been made, and the recurrent attempts at reinstating and giving different angles at how that is and why that is. So this is what I'm inviting all of you to partake in this investigation, this experiment, and to see how this aspect of possession shapes both each and every one of us individually and as human beings, as collective group of species. In other words, the aspect of possession here is spoken of as one of the indispensable ways with which consciousness operates itself. So this is what I am inviting you next Saturday to dive into, and feel free to bring your prepared questions, submit them in advance if you are willing to do so. And if there is time, we'll try to make it. Some of these questions can be discussed live through live interaction, because we're going to offer that online gathering via Zoom platform. So it will afford that possibility of two-way interaction. Now, so going back to this theme itself, I would like to lay out some of the, let's say, what could be spoken of as an overview of what this theme really presents and how we are to go about it. So since we all realize by now, this has been spoken many times over and emphasized, that ours is the age of individuality. It is the very culture, the very notion of our culture in the current day, the civilizational consensus is driven towards this realization of that potential of what individual here represents. There's a long history of that. We can look into the way how it all developed, let's say from societies where the very notion of individual perhaps did not exist, certainly not to the degree to which it is now spoken and looked upon. We could argue that some of the early civilizations were entirely different in terms of the layout. The very notion of individual comprised a very, very unifying aspect within that civilizational setup, where the notion of individual itself not only not mattered, but could not even be afforded in the sense of a particularly given social structure. But I'm not going to go into this now, because this is not our purpose. This is just to give us that POV in terms of the historical outline of how what we speak of as individuality, what it means to be individual, is potentially not just a newly formed phenomena, but something which is yet truly come to the formation of what it represents. And these attempts were already made as far back as mid-19th century. We could even say and argue that the arrival of this whole school known as existentialists or existentialism somewhere in Central Europe, and approximately around that time, and that movement was not as homogeneous as it may seem through the lenses of historical perspective, because it was comprised of people from various different fields. Philosophers, of course, gave great contribution to that, but there were also poets, writers, and social figures of various statutes, all of whom were pointing to this, which one way or another perhaps took a very different turn, going even further back at the time of the Renaissance, where the ideas and ideals of the ancient world were taken out, as it were, excavated from the ruins that were deeply carried by the layers of the earth itself, herself, were brought to light by this revived, renewed interest in how the ancients view this. So the very notion of demos, in fact, the democracy that we speak of today, liberal democracy, the very slogan of it, all have its roots in these ideas that were formed and formulated as far back as the days of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, whom are often considered the fathers of Western civilization in terms of how, the fathers of Western philosophy, how all that would unfold from there in two principal veins, that of dialectical materialism of Aristotle and that of what would be later known as Neoplatonism, the idealism of Plato, and these two parallel veins eventually radically parting because one went into that what would be then exemplified through the progressive industrialization, the birth of the very, very new culture, very, very new ways of coexistence, and that progressive industrialization, to which we will return later, in terms of the ideology that it required, which was materialistic and remained to be materialistic, all the way to this day, when the ideas of artificial intelligence are seen as that possibility, that artificial intelligence, in fact, has the capacity to have intelligence of its own. And the vein of idealism that could be linked back to Plato existed and took different permutations all through the work of other very well-known philosophers in the Occident, culminating, let's say, into these two principal schools, idealism, materialism, never converging, and bringing us now to this point in time when we need to look for some kind of greater systematic understanding in terms of what individual here represents, because both systems of schools were looking at the concept of individual very attentively. You see, we are not here to dismiss outright the existence of an individual, as it is often done in non-dual traditions, in traditions that, let's say, have great affinity with or somehow influenced by Abrahamic traditions, this notion of soul versus the almighty absolute, and the subordinate status of the soul to that greater power, which is one and the only power. So we're not speaking about this. You see, what's important is first and foremost give an alternative perspective on what could comprise that what is either settled on as that set of various different conditions and conditioning known as human condition altogether. And that what is, let's say, dismissing it all, reinstating that our essence is divine, our essence is absolute and nothing else, and therefore all that is irrelevant. We are taking a different approach altogether here. And the approach here is utilizing and using the understanding prevalent in Tantric teaching and Tantric philosophy, where the psychology of a human being has a different origin altogether. So more about it in, let's say, maybe in the second half of this presentation. So since we understand that we live in the age of individuality, it makes perfect sense that we ought to truly get to the bottom of what it really signifies in terms of its complexity when it comes to the process of individuation when viewed from the consciousness-based perspective. And this is significant. This consciousness-based perspective and the process of individuation here is of utmost, let's say, importance, because many of us familiar with the necessity to disidentify. Many of us familiar, those of us who have tapered with various spiritual teachings, let alone dived deep enough for some answers, know this approach, that the source of our suffering, let's say, the source of our misery, the source of unease, is one way or another rooted in not knowing our true essence. And that in turn is being viewed from the perspective of that essence is being abstracted, eclipsed, by virtue of us identifying, or individual, what comprises then of that unit, with a particular set of circumstances. And these circumstances are spoken in terms of human birth. So here we have human, and every human being has a set of circumstances. This set of circumstances is determined above all else, or to begin with that particular DNA, where one is born to these parents, not other parents, and this country, not other country, born in this particular class, societal class, and this, and so forth. So in other words, these are the foundational grounds, and then that whole conglomerate is being built, reified, and crystallized into that notion of which we have spoken earlier, which requires to have that mirror in the collective perception for it to throw us back our image, for us to complete that. So that image that we have of ourselves is then reflected back, and somewhere in the process of that synthesis of how we perceive ourselves, how we would like to be perceived by others, and how others actually perceive us, that completes that picture of identity. So we all know that the methodologies are there, and the whole message, if we were to formulate that message, if we are to give it an overview, is to disidentify with the temporal. So the invitation, the very incentive is to, in order to see who we truly are, we need to reverse that identity. In some cases, the process of reversal is not even spoken of, but simply to disidentify with this conglomerate, with this set of crystallized ideas and notions, you see? So yes, this is given, this is known, this is there are methodologies for that, ways of how. Yet this is not what we're speaking of here. What interests us here is the very process of individuation, by virtue of which the very notion of individual is born in the first place. And the argument is here is that that in itself is rooted in consciousness and nowhere else. So the fact that we experience this in individuality is not a somehow individually tailored shortcoming, or not tailored, individually, let's say, cut out shortcoming, tailored to our needs, as it were, blindly, so as to forgo the very essence of who we are by walking in that, let's say, self-created dress, whereas the king is naked, in fact. This is not the proposition. The proposition here is that the very notion of identity, just as the fundamental quality of possession, is how consciousness acts at all times. So this is second proposition is being made, that in order to being able to truly transform one's self of identity, one needs to either know the mechanics, or I wouldn't even say either. One would need to know the mechanics behind this, and one would need to go through the process firsthand, where that possibility of what took place by virtue of this particular sense of identity is being, let's say, expanded and transformed into another structural identity that is the language of consciousness itself. This may sound in contradiction to a lot of spiritual teachings out there, but this is very important to give it a consideration, because it covers two territories at once. In doing so, we are given a possibility to reevaluate and redress the full gamut of what we speak of here as this psychological setup, psychological makeup of what makes us human. And since this becomes increasingly important in our given day and age, in our culture, that that notion needs to go a tremendous reevaluation, because otherwise we cannot function in a society for which we are born to function. We are bound to function here as social beings. So we are balancing this seemingly impossible act. One is to get to the bottom of who we are in terms of this encapsulated identity, and how that encapsulated identity can then be in service of that what is required by virtue of social interaction for it to truly form a society which is not based on utopia, totalitarian system, or anarchy. So in other words, this is not just a strictly metaphysical exercise. This exercise has its purpose at reevaluating the very way our whole education functions, and the fields of psychology themselves, the field of psychiatry, all that what comprises, as it were, that network of safeguarding and reassuring that society lives in a healthy state. Society manages to find that balance and not tilt it and not taken into the extremes. Of course, this is just giving us an outline, because I don't want to go straight into the critical analysis of what is plain obvious and has been perhaps put more directly in our previous title of this webinar, right? When we kind of played with terms like collective psychosis and holy cows and all the rest of it. So we've tamed that down deliberately so as to pace ourselves in a more stagely manner as to evaluate, first and foremost, what it means to be individual, how individual is formed. If this is a consciously based process, what forces are at work that create that cohesive sense of individual? And as a result, this gives us, or hopefully will give us, an insight into how, when certain forces that are at work again can create havoc and lead to the destruction of an individual, and likewise with the destruction of an individual being a unit out of which collective or field of collective consciousness is formed, to the very, very collapse of the societal order and the collapse of the very, very, what we speak of here as collective consciousness, which then becomes subjected to terrible pandemics at the level of the psyche. More about it later, and I'd like us to continue with laying out this overview. So let us just take a momentary pause. So when we speak about this, certain foundational ground also would need to be laid out. And I therefore feel it's important to introduce other primary attributes of consciousness, which are always at work from behind the scenes. And also, more importantly, what goes into the formation of any patterns. When we speak of collective consciousness, when we speak of collective tendencies in society, or likewise, when we speak of tendencies in an individual, there are patterns. So what is the power or the powers that are behind the formation of these patterns? So let's give it an overview. So first and foremost here is vibration. So in other words, the power of consciousness as vibration. This is where the Tantric teachings of particular value and importance, because Tantra is all about that. Tantra is unapologetically, because it derives from Vedic culture, Vedic civilization, and as it has been spoken many times, Vedic civilization is sonic in its origin. Sonic, which means it understands that at the basis of all creation, there is frequency, sound. The sound itself has a whole science in Indian civilization. The sound itself is referred to as the matrix of creation, the very primordial sound. That primordial sound, which is perhaps can be traced in various other cultures from the what is in Gnosis as the Logos, what perhaps is spoken of in some native traditions as the mother's tongue or the song, various different perspectives where that understanding of the primacy of sound is elevated as the very origin of it all. So vibration, therefore, here is a primary source of all nomina and phenomena, and is determined by frequency in various degrees of velocity, which in turn gives rise to language. So we giving it here that trajectory sort of to lay this foundational understanding of what we are to discuss here to begin with. So with the sound, with vibration being that primordial field out of which everything is formed, and likewise maintained by, and in turn reabsorbed into. So this what is spoken of as frequencies in various degrees of velocity gives rise to language. And language here is a primary expression of speech. And it is in turn subjected to the levels of manifestation. Tantra here, likewise, with regard to its provenance, Vedic culture speaks of the 4 levels of speech. We will go into this perhaps in greater detail next Saturday, but we've addressed this many times in our live events, online events. There are videos out there which are entirely dedicated to this very theme of the 4 levels of speech. Just to mention them here: Para, Pashyanti, Madhyama, and Vaikari in Sanskrit. Para stands for that transcendent level of absolute. Pashyanti as that level of first intent, some vibration towards something, some kind of rising of sorts. Madhyama, literally as the term stands for, middle one. This is the level of the mind where it starts to take a particular direction. If at the level of Pashyanti, speech is still at the level of the waves and waves only, at the level of Madhyama, these waves begin to break down into something more particular. If we are to give a double slit experiment with which quantum physics deals with and explains this phenomena, known for. So the level of Madhyama, a particularity already arises, and that belongs to the level of the mind. Finally, everything collapses into something specific, particular at the level of manifested speech, in Sanskrit known as Vaikari, which in turn gives rise to mental field as primary source of all ideas and ideologies. So these three let's say primary attributes here are interlinked and indispensable in terms of whatever goes on at any level of creation, irrespective of whether this is a formation of the supernova, a process of petrification of wood into a new substance as stone, something as flickering as the lightning, which takes practically no time, and something which is taking, let's say, millions of years for it to form. All this is subject to vibration. All this is determined, maintained, and absorbed into by the field of that, what in this particular perspective known as the field of Shakti, the field of power, the power of vibration. So in order to understand individual and universal consciousness, in order to understand how individual consciousness and collective consciousness sit together, what is influences what correlational affair governs this, we need to have this primal understanding that all this is based and dependent on vibrations, first and foremost. Then comes language. Language, that tower of the Babel, the tower, the language here, you see, the universal metaphor that the Babel tower stands for here is that language, though an expression of consciousness itself, right, which we have established just a moment ago, in the result of these vibrations, right, which depending on the frequency, which gives rise to the noumena and the phenomena. Noumena in terms of that what cannot be perceived, cannot be experienced through the senses, which belongs only to that subtle mental field. All belongs to the field of vibration, down to tactile experience of being in the world, partaking that firsthand through all the apertures for which the body is equipped with organs of cognition. All this is a field of vibrations, as simple as that. And language here, being an expression of consciousness, of course, is where, at least tantrically speaking, is where everything gets into that very, very interesting set of circumstances where consciousness, as it were, completely and utterly transforms itself into whatever is then subjected to the way how it manifests at the level of that final fourth level of speech known as Vaikari, because that what creates and crystallizes the mental field, which then gives rise to all these ideas and ideologies which become the, we could say, consensus for any given culture at any moment in time we find ourselves. Our time we live now is no exception. So our time we live now is a result, this very, very moment in time, and what we experience collectively and individually is an outcome of the particular way how these mental fields themselves formed out of the way the language has been developed, spoken, and given this vibratory field at the level of expression, at the level of what is spoken, at the level of what is written, at the level of then how these ideas get exchanged, creates that field, what some modern day thinkers called morphic resonance. I'm using this freely because I don't know if Rupert Sheldrake will agree with that or not, but that term morphic resonance, or that what becomes then a shared pool of certain ideas and ideologies is influenced by language, primarily because it's the way consciousness expresses itself at the level of that final fourth, the level of manifestation, that vaikari, where everything is then in that conglomerate, in that matrix, in that kaleidoscope, in that we can give that maybe analogy of the hologram. In that hologram, it takes forms based on the way the language functions. So the importance of the language here is very, very significant and cannot be overestimated, simply because it's that what constantly tightens and sharpens and creates this temporary sense of how things are, and it seems like that's how things always been. So this feeling that this is indeed how things are, and there's nothing we can do about it, or nothing can be changed. This is the very, very notion of living in a particular culture is determined by the language. Now, I don't want to go now onto the level of what language would then be, let's say, as the primary source, because this is a second stage of consideration in terms of which particular language, because at this level we speak right now, it's not even that important. It doesn't matter if it's English, French, Russian, Chinese, every language here, every different lingual expression, once these ideas get shared, begins to contribute to the formation of a certain field, you see? So from there on, we could say there is this, a field opens up, I would even say battleground, where these ideas and ideologies having the face-off in terms of what is being here decided and what gains more momentum, what has more power, what has more velocity. More about this later. So just to keep giving us that outline of what we set to discuss. So now, given that overview, let us take another short pause and maybe leave this, what we discussed, for a moment and introduce another now term, that of another trend, rather. The trend that we currently live is that known as transhumanism. So we have established, or at least gave it as a supposition, that we live in the age of individuality. And not only that, we have the, let's say, audacity to question the very premises upon which we operate in terms of what we define individuality here per se. So in other words, this is an attempt to redefine what individuality truly represents. And if we are to use consciousness-based model, it will become apparent that individuality is not as simple as it seems. And it's not something that one can discard as a set of garments worn on a day. And we will delve into it with greater, let's say, emphasis on the actual day. But now I would like to introduce this another term, and that we live in the age of transhumanism. What's interesting about this is that although transhumanism has been kind of gotten into more wide use only in the last, I don't know, maybe 20 years, even if that. The term itself is very ancient, very old. So I'd like to read this excerpt from Wikipedia dedicated to transhumanism. So this is a quote. Transhumanism is a philosophical and intellectual movement that advocates the enhancement of the human condition by developing and making widely available sophisticated technologies that can greatly enhance longevity, cognition, and well-being. Quote closes. That's from Wikipedia. It's not invented, just looked it up. And obviously, this, when we read this, makes it much more complex than just dismissing transhumanism in its associations with the age of technological advancement, because that would give it an injustice in terms of what that truly represents. After all, this end of that quote, right? Making widely available sophisticated technologies that can greatly enhance longevity, cognition, and well-being. Isn't it logical or simply correct to say that the whole entire course of history of humankind is this very attempt at greatly enhance longevity, cognition, and well-being? So therefore, transhumanism here is a legitimate movement. Again, if we are to look at it from the perspective of consciousness-based understanding, the transhumanism here is a very, very normal, legitimate way of how everything we do here, every attempt, every enterprise, one way or another, would have to carry some elements of transhumanism. Unless, of course, we slide into some radically different perspectives. And at this very moment, I wouldn't do this mental exercise. I'd like us to stay on the course of what we've been speaking so far. So what instead I'd like to point our attention is that there is this history and there is this predecessor and complexity of transhumanism movement, as it is known today, let's say. And that takes us back all the way to the ancient civilizations, ancient epics, all the way to Frankenstein, Captain America, to all these various different ways of how Hollywood was playing with these ideas, to the transcendentalists, to the self-help industry, to the final frontier where merging of the human and artificial intelligence is simply seen as an inevitable way the civilization is going. So you see, transhumanism here definitely needs some second viewing, if not redefining what it truly stands for. So instead of dismissing, and I myself also could be blamed for doing that in one of the online courses, let's say, I think it's in the Yoga of Integrity, if I'm not mistaken, we have made some allusions and bounced off these ideas, giving it critical overview, but it was given only that aspect of transhumanism that is mostly associated with the almost religious beliefs in the power of technology. More about it later again, but here I'd like to give this reevaluation for myself and for everyone interested in reflecting on this, that transhumanism, in fact, is very, very on par with how consciousness itself functions. We could even see that the term transhumanism can be extended here as an umbrella for every insights that never were gained in any culture, in any form, that had these attempts at bridging this, what we speak about, this experience, this individual experience, this affair of being an embodied being, which is known for just whatever time is it given in that particular form. So therefore it is known as a very, very fleeting, if not fragile affair, speaking metaphysically. Attempts were always there to go beyond, to transcend, to unify the polarities. Attempts were made to, let's say, from the analogies known in various cultures, which how the alchemy itself unfolded and gained its provenance, these attempts at arriving to immortal body. This very, very interests in today's field of neuroscience, if there is a possibility of radically extending lifespan of a human being. All this can be seen in lieu of what the term, right, transhumanism stands for. Because this transhumanism here represents the very desire in consciousness to forgo that limitation imposed upon itself by virtue of this progressive identification, which crystallized into this notion of a mortal being, which then needs to be somehow, by hook or by crook, a settled affair, or discarding these limitations and going, let's say, beyond the notion of what it represents. So we could see this in itself a tremendous reservoir that is always there at work, which trying to overcome that what it in the first place expresses itself as so and so in its particularity. So therefore I argue now, as a third point of argument, that we live in the age of individuality, we live in the age of transhumanism, and there is a correlation between that, what comprises individuality itself as a phenomenon, and that what is the driving force behind overcoming that sense of individuality, which could turn out to be the very, very purpose of why we are individual, why we have individual experience in the first place. Well, we need to tread slowly here. I don't want to just kind of give so-called ready-made answers. I'd like us to pace ourselves tentatively, because I'm not interested in shortcuts. I'm not interested in some kind of pseudo cop-out ways of how to just trespass or bypass all this. I'm interested in the very, very juice of what this embodiment here offers and what the individuality here comprises in its locus. So therefore, we are treading here that in that kind of a more of a pacely manner. So redefining transhumanism, okay? So difference between consciousness-based and technology-based models. Again, as that ongoing battle between idealism and materialism. You see that what we have outlined earlier, the departure that led to two main veins, in terms of the ideological understanding of the very purpose of all this is, that gave the two radically different schools, materialism and that of idealism. And that can be seen also in terms of how transhumanism itself here can be viewed. So the transhumanism here also can be viewed in a very positivist way in terms of attempts at transforming human nature. Nothing less than that. So all the spiritual epics, all these epics of various cultures, from Ramayana to Mahabharata, the Gilgamesh, anything that we can trace, this very, which are kind of form the, or even what is at the basis, let's say, of Mediterranean culture, right? The Iliad and Odyssey, and all these epics that have been formed at some point, they have these elements, very strong elements of transhumanism. So when it comes to the spiritual teachings and traditions, it could also be spoken of applying that very understanding, because the noble purpose was always to go beyond the set of notions and ideas that we have ended up with. And therefore, that transhumanism here should not be discarded if it carries the connotations with the, let's say, how it is mostly spoken today in relation to technological progress. But we, of course, we would have to give this a closer scrutiny in terms of what happens and what price we are paying when that technological advancement here somehow giving us this promise that it will sort out the very notion of what it means to be human, that it somehow can redress the very human affair, a human condition, and give us that complete and utter visa out of this predicament we found ourselves. This, of course, would need to be looked into attentively and not just follow on that same kind of, not just jump on a bandwagon of bashing these perspectives. We need to come up with a solid alternatives in terms of why these perspectives are doomed to fail. Let's put it this way. So now, let's say more specifically, when we will speak about this, and it can be outlined in terms of the age of technological advancement and the rise of psychosis, because this is where the convergence of the themes would be given a chance to give us that build up, where we can create this arch between where we have started, from where we have started, and that whole insight into the perspective on the archetypal forces behind these processes of what takes and begins to possess all aspects of human life at an individual level, likewise at the collective level. And of course, we are welcome here to examine and re-examine the very relationship between individual and collective. Because from some point of view, it's almost inconsistent to speak about individual because it is being dismissed as an epiphenomena. It doesn't exist. It's an illusion. At another level, it is undeniable fact of all experiences, that all and every one of us have individual experience. So there has to be something here where, although we may agree from the grand perspective, from the perspective of awareness, individual does not exist, or individual is indeed a certain point of view given for awareness to entertain itself, a vantage point where that and only that what can give an insight into the eternal, all-encompassing, infinite nature. So the finite nature of all experiences, the very finitude of what we consider ourselves to be here, could be spoken in these terms, and it is spoken in these terms. So therefore, we will do that as well. But what I'm suggesting here is to give ourselves this free dive into what comprises that formation of individual, and what would that in turn truly represent, or in other words, what does it actually mean to be truly individual? Or we can further tweak that. What does it mean to be truly human? So these are the main theses. And that converging arc here is with regard to what is spoken of as, let's say, that particular aspect of transhumanism, which links our destiny, collective destiny, to the technological advancement, and how that, whether in turn or simultaneously, is accompanied by undeniable rise of psychosis. So this can also be outlined in basic terms. So we all know that factors that contribute to the formation of psychosis are isolation, which leads to loneliness. That in turn leads to loss of purpose, loss of meaning, which we all experience today, at an individual and at a collective level. Both of which in turn leads to anxiety and depression as an outcome, as a kind of, if you will, diagnosis here, very clearly outlined in terms of what's at the basis of this, what plucking society as rising sense of anxiety, which is rooted in that sense of uncertainty. And that sense of uncertainty, of course, is an outcome or reflection of the loss of purpose. Because when there is no purpose, when there is no meaning, then everything collapses. The whole, let's say, raison d'etre of why we're alive is pulled beneath our feet. When that happens, then that free flow is not a very pleasant affair. So rise of anxiety is a collective phenomenon. And anxiety and depression here are linked, interlinked, and overlap their territories. So let's just give this remaining few minutes as we will begin to wrap up our live broadcast, is that less pleasant aspect of how all these functions at the level of collective affairs, when we speak to the anxiety and how this has been witnessed historically and more recently with regard to the, let's say, what we all collectively experiencing for the past few years. What is also known as mass formation, formation of collective consensus, social engineering, and so forth. So this could be defined as known versus unknown forms of anxiety. So source of collectively shared Anxiety is one of the main socially binding factors when it comes to any danger, perceived or real. And this is because we are social beings. Maybe because we were programmed by millions of years of that coexistence. So that known versus unknown plays tremendous role and tremendous input. So when there are certain aspects that, let's say, certain whatever external, let's say, aspect that are threatening a tribe or a community, it always becomes that binding glue, that cohesiveness of collective consciousness, where people, if prior to that, live in much more isolated manner, begin to feel the necessity to have this shared, even if in the face of that danger, purpose. This has been always known, of course, but particularly have been implemented into methodology of its own since 19th century, arguably, where the birth of the very term propaganda came into use and has been utilized ever since. And we could see that today the conflicts and battles are not only fought on the battlefield. There are two battlefields always take place simultaneously. There's an actual physical battlefield somewhere, or maybe not necessarily physical battlefield where it manifests as a concrete conflict, as we can begin to name them. And every decade, there are plenty of examples of these ongoing battles. There are also simultaneously battles that are fought for our minds, because that war, perhaps even more important, the victory claimed on a battlefield is one thing, and the victory claimed on the subtle field, in the mind field, is by far more important in our day and age. The reasons for that, of course, will be further unpacked in our next Saturday's gathering. But here, just to give that outline. So what lays the fertile ground for people who prior to that felt totally isolated and living meaningless life, plagued by all these senses of insecurity, all that energy often is then mobilized and into formation of what I could just simply use as that term, forming a mob mentality. And that mob mentality here obviously has negative connotations, just as it has positive connotations when it comes to coming together in the face of imminent danger. Let's say in the previous millennia, it would be, or not just millennia, like let's say in the earlier phases of civilization, there were plenty of external factors that human beings had to unite against to withstand. Climatic challenges, cataclysmic events, ways of being able to sustain themselves, whether hunters or gatherers or agricultural based forms of coexistence. All these required the quite an orchestrated way of how the purpose was defined very clearly. In our day and age, this purpose is withdrawn. So there is this progressive deterioration of the sense of community. We all know that. I'm not going to spend now these last few minutes by speaking to the obvious. The list is so long and exhaustive that we can just keep adding new and new numbers in terms of how all this way life turned out to be now contributes to further and further deterioration of that fabric of society itself, where we, on one hand, give that illusory sense of connection, whereas in fact, we're getting more and more isolated from that, what maybe just a number of years, let alone centuries prior to that, was a way of life. But that, of course, the attempts at creating this and utilizing these very energies that are always at play there, right? This very mechanics at work. So whenever there is this unspecified source of anxiety, which then in turn breeds the need to identify, to pin down that source of something into a tangible form. And that in turn begins to provide an incentive for what could be termed as collectively shared purpose. So that collectively shared purpose here is always at work by those who try to manufacture the consent. And I could simply use the term identifying the dragon. Of course, it's just a borrowed term, right? It could be used in spelled in through the inverted commas, right? As a metaphor. So identifying the dragon here is, effectively speaking, what creates the possibility of funneling all that anxiety, which prior to that was simply a result of that deterioration of society, which comes as a result of isolation, which leads to loneliness, loss of purpose, anxiety, and depression. Now all that is being funneled into newly found purpose, where the dragon is identified and everyone is reaching for the pitchforks, and the crusade is being very quickly formed to go and reclaim the lost Jerusalem, because this has become the holy war. So this is a very well-known phenomena, very well known. This is why it's so important to not to allow that carefully orchestrated, manufactured consent to take over. And the reasons for that would be unpacked in our meeting next Saturday, because we will speak about the further mechanics between how that spiritual quest for freedom is always impeded here when we become subjected to this ideological warfare, which is just loosely defined here by us as identifying the dragon. It becomes the binding impetus for newly rediscovered purpose, full stop. The act of locating that source of anxiety to specific object is what gives that false sense of security in the face of unidentified fear otherwise. You see? So this gives birth to a narrative in turn, and with that the sense of connection and solidarity in a shared cause, shared purpose, joining forces in hunting down the dragon or something which threatens our collective safety becomes heroic enterprise, and effectively speaking, what leads to mental illness, mental intoxication. So this is the arch that I'd like us to explore next Saturday in this forthcoming webinar dedicated to this very theme, being possessed by the archetypal forces. How we are here attempting to cover the ground of what it means to be truly individual, how that in turn collects to the formation of the collective consciousness as a field, and how within this conflicting often forces found its play, and this what suggestion is being made makes the job of any of us who is here sincerely to break through that much more difficult, if not impossible, simply because the field itself act from that place where these archetypal forces are always at work. So this effectively speaking is to redefine the state of affairs when it comes to formation of collective psychoses, which then become the very trait of our culture. And willingly or unwillingly, wittingly or not, consciously or unconsciously, we become participant of that culture, which could in no time to turn into such an ugly way of formation, where we have historical analogies, where it happens right as we speak, and whether we like it or not, none of us are given and exempt from actually being pulled by these polarizing forces. So this is, let's say, how I would like to give that kind of overview to what is here, being as an invitation to dive at a certain angle that is being now outlined and give it a more, or rather deeper, insight and investigation. Okay, dears? So thank you everyone for giving it another shot to get together. So hopefully this time it was a successful transmission. No forces messed up with our intent to communicate. And I wish you all a blessed rest of the day. Just looking forward to get together next Saturday. Thank you all. And bye for now.